I didn't disappear. I didn't run away. I didn't break down in a way anyone could see. I stayed. I stayed present, available, reliable. I stayed where I was expected to stay. And slowly, without realizing it, I stopped living my own life. I lived for everyone else. That sounds dramatic, but it didn't feel that way at the time. It felt normal. Responsible. Even admirable. I was the one who adjusted, who compromised, who made things easier for others. If something needed to be done, I did it. If someone needed support, I stayed. If a situation required patience, I swallowed my frustration and called it maturity. People trusted me. They leaned on me. They needed me. And for a long time, I believed that was enough. I told myself that life wasn't about personal fulfillment. That it was about duty, stability, and showing up when it mattered. I believed that wanting more was a sign of immaturity, that dissatisfaction meant I lacked gratitude. So I pushed my own needs aside. At first, it didn't hurt. It felt like strength. I was proud of how much I could carry. Proud of how little I asked for in return. I learned how to be low maintenance, how to adapt, how to make myself useful instead of visible. But usefulness has a cost. The more I focused on what others needed from me, the less I paid attention to what I needed from myself. I stopped asking uncomfortable questions. I stopped noticing the quiet resistance inside me. I told myself that my discomfort wasn't important enough to interrupt the lives of people around me. There was always a reason not to change. Someone depended on me. Now wasn't the right time. Things would settle down later. Later became my excuse for everything. Years passed like that. Not painfully. Not dramatically. Efficiently. I became very good at managing life instead of living it. I handled responsibilities, solved problems, kept things running. From the outside, I looked stable and capable. Inside, I felt increasingly distant from myself. I noticed it in small moments. When someone asked how I was doing and I answered automatically without checking. When I accomplished something and felt nothing afterward. When I imagined the future and couldn't feel excitement, only obligation. Still, I stayed. Because leaving felt selfish. Because choosing myself felt like betrayal. Because I had built a life where my role mattered more than my presence. I told myself this was just adulthood. That everyone feels this way eventually. That personal dreams fade and responsibility takes over. I repeated those thoughts until they felt like facts. But something inside me was shrinking. I stopped wanting things that didn't serve a purpose. I stopped dreaming in ways that didn't make sense on paper. I began filtering every desire through a question that quietly ruled my life: how will this affect everyone else? If the answer wasn't reassuring, I dropped the desire entirely. That's how I lost myself. Not in one decision, but in hundreds of small ones. Each time I chose to be needed instead of being honest. Each time I prioritized harmony over truth. Each time I told myself that my life could wait. The moment that changed everything wasn't dramatic. Someone asked me a simple question. What do you want? They didn't mean it deeply. It wasn't a confrontation. Just a casual question, thrown into a conversation without weight. But it landed hard. I opened my mouth to answer, and nothing came out. My mind went blank. I realized I had no idea how to respond without referencing someone else's needs. Without framing my answer around responsibilities, expectations, or timing. I didn't know what I wanted independent of what others needed from me. That silence terrified me. Later that night, alone, I understood something I couldn't ignore anymore. I had become a supporting character in my own life. Not because anyone forced me into that role, but because I volunteered for it. Over and over again. Because it felt safer to be useful than to be seen. I had lived for everyone else so completely that there was barely any space left for me. And the worst part was this: no one was going to stop me. No one was going to say, "You've done enough. Now it's your turn." If I wanted my life back, I would have to risk disappointing people. I would have to risk guilt. I would have to risk no longer being needed in the same way. And I didn't know yet if I was strong enough for that. All I knew was this: staying where I was needed had cost me something I could no longer afford to lose. Myself. Once I saw what I had done, I couldn't unsee it. Living for everyone else had been a slow process, but realizing it was immediate and brutal. It was like stepping into a room I'd lived in for years and suddenly noticing there were no mirrors anywhere. I had shaped myself around other people's needs so completely that I no longer had a clear reflection of who I was. And the most painful part was this: I didn't feel angry at anyone else. I felt guilty for even noticing. Guilt had become the invisible structure holding my life together. It was the reason I stayed quiet, the reason I stayed put, the reason I told myself my desires were optional. Every time I thought about change, guilt appeared instantly, armed with logic. How can you think about leaving when others rely on you? How can you want more when you already have enough? How can you put yourself first without becoming selfish? Those questions didn't sound cruel. They sounded reasonable. Moral, even. And because they sounded moral, I obeyed them without question. That's how guilt traps you. It convinces you that suffering quietly is virtuous. I began to notice how often guilt decided my behavior before I had time to think. If I felt tired, guilt reminded me of people who had it worse. If I felt restless, guilt told me to be grateful. If I felt unhappy, guilt accused me of being dramatic. So I learned to dismiss myself before anyone else could. Outwardly, I was calm, reliable, put together. Inwardly, I felt increasingly disconnected from my own emotions. I didn't trust them anymore. I treated them like inconveniences, signals to be managed instead of messages to be understood. That disconnect showed up everywhere. I felt resentment in places where I thought I felt love. Exhaustion where I thought I felt loyalty. Emptiness where I thought I felt purpose. The lines blurred until I couldn't tell whether I was being generous or just afraid to stop. I started asking myself uncomfortable questions. If no one needed me tomorrow, who would I be? If I stopped being useful, would I still matter? If I chose myself, who would I disappoint, and could I live with that? Those questions terrified me, not because they were dramatic, but because they were practical. They forced me to confront a truth I had avoided for years: my identity was built on being needed. And anything built that way collapses the moment you consider leaving. The internal crisis deepened quietly. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I functioned as usual, but with a growing sense of dread beneath everything I did. Every responsibility felt heavier now, because it wasn't just a task. It was a reminder of how trapped I felt by my own reliability. I realized I had confused obligation with meaning. Just because something depended on me didn't mean it fulfilled me. Just because people benefited from my presence didn't mean I was alive inside it. Still, I stayed. Because guilt doesn't loosen its grip easily. I told myself I could adjust without changing anything. Be more mindful. Be more grateful. Be less demanding of life. I tried to shrink my needs until they would fit into the margins of my responsibilities. But the more I shrank, the louder the emptiness became. I began to feel like I was slowly disappearing inside my own body. Present in conversations, absent in decisions. Awake during the day, numb at night. I wasn't depressed in a way anyone could diagnose. I was hollow in a way no one could see. That made it worse. Invisible pain doesn't get permission to exist. I remember a moment, small, insignificant to anyone else, when I felt something in me break. Someone thanked me for always being there. For always understanding. For never making things about myself. They meant it as praise. I smiled. I nodded. I accepted it. And inside, something collapsed. I realized that, never making things about myself, had become my defining trait. That my absence was being interpreted as kindness. That my silence was being rewarded. I went home that night and sat in the dark, trying to answer a question I could no longer avoid: what happens if I stop? What happens if I stop being the one who absorbs everything? What happens if I stop prioritizing everyone else's comfort over my own truth? What happens if I choose myself, even once? The answers were terrifying. People would be disappointed. Some would be hurt. Some might pull away. And I would feel guilty. But then another answer appeared, quiet, steady, undeniable. If I didn't stop, I would lose myself completely. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. Gradually. Permanently. That was the real moral dilemma. Not duty versus selfishness. But self-erasure versus self-respect. I understood then that guilt had been guiding my life, not values. I hadn't chosen to live for others out of love alone. I had done it out of fear, fear of being judged, abandoned, misunderstood. Fear of choosing myself and discovering I wasn't allowed to. That realization didn't make me brave. It made me honest. For the first time, I admitted something I had been ashamed to think: living for everyone else had become a way to avoid living at all. It was safer to be needed than to be seen. Safer to be reliable than to be real. Safer to sacrifice quietly than to risk wanting something more. But safety had come at a cost I could no longer ignore. I didn't know yet what I would change. I didn't know how to untangle duty from guilt, love from obligation, generosity from fear. All I knew was this: if I continued living this way, there would be nothing left of me to give. And no amount of being needed would make that loss acceptable. The moment I chose myself didn't feel powerful. It felt wrong. Not ethically wrong, emotionally wrong. Like stepping out of line. Like breaking an unspoken rule I had followed for so long that it felt like law. My body reacted before my mind could catch up. Tight chest. Shallow breath. That familiar pull of guilt, rising fast, urgent, demanding that I stop. That was how I knew this was real. If it had been easy, it wouldn't have mattered. I didn't announce anything. I didn't make declarations or draw lines in the sand. I made one small decision that went against my instinct to disappear. I said no. Not dramatically. Not angrily. Just clearly. And then I didn't explain myself to make it easier for everyone else. The silence that followed was unbearable. Not because anyone attacked me, but because they didn't know what to do with this version of me. The one who didn't automatically bend. The one who didn't rush to justify their needs as reasonable or temporary or harmless. I felt exposed. For the first time in years, I wasn't hiding behind usefulness. The guilt hit immediately. It flooded my thoughts with images of disappointment, inconvenience, subtle resentment. Fear told me I had made a mistake. That I was being selfish. That this was exactly why people like me weren't supposed to choose themselves. And for a moment, I almost went back. That's the truth no one talks about. Choosing yourself doesn't feel liberating at first. It feels like betrayal, especially when your identity has been built on sacrifice. When people have learned to depend on your absence, your presence feels disruptive. But something stopped me. Not confidence. Not clarity. Memory. I remembered how empty I had felt sitting alone at night, exhausted but invisible. How heavy it felt to be thanked for disappearing. How terrifying it was to realize that if I kept going this way, I would eventually have nothing left to give, because there would be nothing left of me. That memory held me in place. So I stayed with the discomfort. And the world didn't end. Some people reacted exactly as I feared. Confusion. Distance. Quiet disappointment. A few made me feel guilty without saying the word. Others tried to pull me back into the role I had always played. It hurt. Because I cared. Because I still loved them. But something else began to happen too. I felt solid. Not happy. Not relieved. Solid. My thoughts no longer fought my actions. My inner world wasn't screaming while my outer world smiled politely. For the first time in years, I felt aligned, even though that alignment was uncomfortable. I realized then that guilt had been my compass for a long time. Not love. Not values. Guilt. And guilt always points back to the familiar. It keeps you small. It convinces you that your worth depends on how little space you take up. I stopped following it. Not all at once. Not perfectly. I still felt it every time I chose myself. But I stopped obeying it automatically. I started asking a different question: am I acting from love, or from fear of disappointing others? The answer changed everything. Some relationships shifted permanently. A few faded. Not because I stopped caring, but because they were built on who I was willing to erase myself for. When I stopped doing that, there was nothing left to hold them together. That loss was painful. But it was honest. And honesty, I learned, is a kind of relief, even when it hurts. I also discovered something unexpected. When I stopped living entirely for others, I didn't become cruel or detached. I became clearer. More intentional. More present. The care I gave was no longer automatic, it was chosen. And because it was chosen, it meant more. I didn't stop loving. I stopped disappearing. That distinction saved me. I began to feel time differently. Days no longer slipped past unnoticed. Even difficult moments felt sharper, more alive. I could feel regret, but also agency. I could feel fear, but also direction. I was no longer surviving my life. I was inhabiting it. Do I still feel guilt? Yes. But guilt no longer decides for me. I see it now for what it is, a signal, not a command. A reminder of old patterns, not a moral truth. I can feel it without letting it erase me. And that took practice. The second chance I had been waiting for didn't arrive as a gift. It arrived as a responsibility. The responsibility to stop hiding behind sacrifice. To stop confusing being needed with being alive. To stop calling self-erasure love. I lived for everyone else for a long time. Not because they asked me to. But because I didn't believe I was allowed to live for myself. That belief almost cost me my life, not in one dramatic moment, but in countless quiet ones where I chose obligation over truth. Choosing myself didn't fix everything. But it gave me something I had lost for years. A voice. A center. A place to stand. If you're listening to this and you recognize yourself, if your life feels full but you feel absent, if you're praised for your strength but secretly feel hollow, hear this clearly: you are not selfish for wanting your life back. You are not cruel for choosing yourself. You are not abandoning others by refusing to abandon yourself. No one will give you permission. You have to take it. I lived for everyone else and forgot to live for myself. Until I realized that a life lived entirely for others is not noble, it's unfinished. And finishing it starts with one quiet, terrifying, honest choice: to finally be here.